The Tiny Giants, the day without Bigness. In a land far, far away, where the mountains touch the clouds and the rivers sing cheerful songs, there was a village of giants. But these weren't your typical giants. They were tiny giants. They were no taller than a loaf of bread and no heavier than a watermelon, but they still called themselves the Mighty Giants of Gargantuaville because, well, it sounded cool. The tiny giants had one problem. They relied on their size, which wasn't much, to solve everything. For example, if they couldn't reach a jar of jam on a shelf, they'd try to grow just 1 inch taller by stretching their necks. If they couldn't pull a wagon, they'd grunt and groan and make all sorts of giant noises, hoping the wagon would be scared into moving on its own. One sunny morning, the village elder, Grumble Grow, gathered everyone for a meeting. "Today, fellow giants," he bellowed, standing on a mushroom to seem taller, "we will have a day without using our size to solve anything. And no stretching, and no grunting, and no giant noises. We will solve problems with our wits." The crowd gasped. No giant noises? No stretch-neck tricks? How would they survive? The first challenge of the day arrived when Tumbletip, a tiny giant with hair as wild as a tumbleweed, dropped her favorite book in a deep, narrow hole. Normally, she'd puff out her chest and try to reach into the hole, muttering, "I'm bigger than I seem." But today, she remembered Grumble Grow's words. So instead, she looked around and spotted a long, bendy twig. She carefully used the twig to fish her book out of the hole. "Well, that was easy," Tumbletip said, a little surprised. Next up was Gumblegrit, a tiny giant with a big appetite. He found himself facing the ultimate crisis. A delicious pie was cooling on a high windowsill, just out of reach. Normally, he'd do a jump and grunt combo, hoping the pie would fall into his hands. But today, he had to think. After some serious pie staring, Gumblegrit had an idea. He took a few small pebbles and stacked them into a tiny tower. Climbing up, he snagged the pie with ease. "Ha! Who needs to grunt when you've got pebbles?" Gumblegrit proudly said, munching away. But the biggest challenge came when the river's only bridge broke. The tiny giants needed to cross it to reach the next village, but they couldn't just grow taller to leap across. No, today was the day of no Bigness. The whole village stood by the riverbank, scratching their tiny heads. Then, Tiny Teeny, the youngest of all, spoke up. "Why don't we work together?" she suggested, pointing at the tall reeds growing by the water. "If we weave them together, we can make a raft." The idea was so simple, yet brilliant. The tiny giants got to work, weaving the reeds and tying them tight with string made from wildflowers. Soon enough, they had a sturdy little raft that could carry them across the river. By the end of the day, the tiny giants had solved every problem without using their size even once. They realized they didn't need to rely on being giants, tiny or otherwise, when they had clever ideas, teamwork, and maybe a little bit of pie for energy. As the sun set and the stars twinkled overhead, Grumble Grow gathered the village once again. "Well, it seems we've learned a mighty big lesson today," he said, grinning. "Sometimes, the best way to solve a problem isn't by trying to be bigger, but by being smarter." And from that day on, the tiny giants of Gargantuaville used their brains as much as their brawn, except, of course, when it came to pie-eating contests. Some traditions never change. The end.